Power creep is the idea that newer Pokemon are made to be more powerful than older Pokemon, likely so that they get more attention and hype. People often say that each generation of Pokemon is more powerful than the last. This criticism has come up especially in Gen 9, with many feeling like the new Pokemon are so incredibly powerful that all Pokemon from before are invalidated. But is power creep actually real, or is it just in our imagination? In this video, we will be considering two different ways of measuring power creep, and then we will decide once and for all whether power creep is actually real. The first metric we will be analyzing is base stats. I think this is what a lot of people think about when they think about power creep. They usually talk about how Pokemon nowadays have higher base stats, which makes the older Pokemon with lower base stats not able to compete. Especially with Pokemon like Palafin or Calyrex Shadow Rider, they insist that this level of base stats is just so overwhelming that Pokemon like Feraligatr or Mewtwo are completely outclassed. This has always seemed a bit dubious to me, as the range for stats has always been about the same, regular Pokemon being around 400 to 550 base stats. But let's test this with data. Just a note before I start showing you the results, the source I got my data from only had the base stats for one form per Pokemon, and usually this is like the base form. This means that Mega Evolutions and Pokemon with alternate forms, like regional variants or different gendered stats, will not get counted. I don't think this ends up being much of an issue though, as most of the alternate forms are Megas, which are not in the game anymore, so they don't count, or are regional variants or other similar forms that keep the total base stats of the Pokemon the same. If we plot all Pokemon with their base stats, we get the following plot. I honestly don't think this plot is that useful, as it just ends up being quite chaotic. Like, it's very hard to see anything, but there are a couple things to notice. First is this void in the 350 to 400 base stat total range that starts to form in like the more recent generations. You can kind of see it in Gen 4, but it's definitely most prominent in Gens 7, 8, and 9. The second thing to notice is the area between the 550 and 600 base stat has started to fill up more in recent gens. I'll talk a little bit more about these quirks and why they happen later when we start to look at some different plots that end up being more helpful. If we look at the mean BST of each generation, in 9th we have Gen 3 with a mean of 403.7, in 8th we have Gen 2 at 407.2, in 7th we have Gen 1 at 407.6, in 6th we have Gen 5 with a mean of 424.6, in 5th we have Gen 6 with a mean of 429.3, in 4th we have Gen 8 with a mean of 432.1, in 3rd, we have Gen 4 with a mean of 447. In 2nd, we have Gen 7 with a mean of 449.4. And in 1st, we have Gen 9 with a mean of 461.3. This certainly seems to support the idea of statistical power creep, but there are some caveats. This set includes not fully evolved Pokemon, legendaries, mythicals, and other Pokemon that kind of mess up the analysis. That's kind of why I went through it very quickly. These numbers aren't super duper important. If we just consider all fully evolved Pokemon that aren't legendaries, we get the following plot. When I say legendary, I mean legendary, mythical, paradox, and ultra beast. It just is easier to say legendaries. Here we can see that the gap around 350 to 400 was likely the area that doesn't have any fully evolved Pokemon because it's too low, but also doesn't have any middle evolutions because it's too high for those. I think the main trend to notice here is that the distribution gets tighter as the generations go on. So all the Pokemon have more similar stats as the generations go on. Now we can look at the means again, and this time it will tell us more about whether base stat power creep actually exists. In last, we have Gen 3 again with a mean of 464. I was kind of surprised that Gen 3 is last, given that there are good Pokemon from this generation, but I'm not shocked that it's bottom 3, given that it's like one of their first 3. In 8th, we have Gen 2 with a mean of 469. Gen 2 was the generation I thought would be last. People often talk about how there are very few good Gen 2 Pokemon. Currently, there's only one non-legendary Gen 2 Pokemon with above 0.5% usage in Regulation I, and it's Smeargle, which has terrible base stats. But yeah, in 7th is a shocking change. Gen 7 with a mean of 475. Gen 7 falls 5 places without legendaries or not fully evolved Pokemon. Honestly, this is quite surprising given that Gen 7 has quite good Pokemon, but the Ultra Beasts were likely carrying the base stat total before. In 6th, we have Generation 1 with a mean of 482. Gen 1 holds up surprisingly well in this analysis, given that there were so many oversights in game balance, as it was the first game. So it's interesting to see that it is middle of the pack. The top 5 generations are actually all quite close to each other in mean BST. In 5th, we have Gen 5 with BST of 492. I think most of the really great Gen 5 Pokemon are legendaries, such as Landorus, Thundurus, and Tornadus, but it has some quality Pokemon like Whimsicott and Amoonguss as well. In fourth, we have Gen 8 with a mean BST of 495.0. Gen 8 has a lot of very good Pokemon as well, so it's not surprising that it's this high. Next, in third, is Gen 4 with a mean of 495.6. Gen 4 has been a consistent standout in base stat total. This is likely because they added many evolutions to old Pokemon, which already had relatively high base stats for a pre-evolved Pokemon, so their evolutions had higher base stats than normal. In second, we have Gen 6 with a mean of 497. I think Gen 6 is the most forgettable generation in my mind, and it feels like there are very few good Pokemon from this generation as well, so this is a bit of a shock. And remember, this is not including any Mega Evolution, so it's definitely not that. Finally, in first, we have Gen 9 with a mean of 500. Despite maintaining its spot in first, its lead has been significantly cut, likely due to the removal of Paradox Pokemon, which had previously brought it up. Gen 9 has often been described as like the ultimate form of power creep, which our analysis has verified to some extent. Before we start drawing conclusions, I briefly want to look at what happens if we put the legendaries, mythicals, paradoxes, and ultra beasts back in. The results are on screen. The big thing to notice is that Gen 9 and Gen 7 both get bumps because they had a lot of ultra beasts, a lot of paradox, and just a lot of legendaries in general. In conclusion, stat-based power creep does not exist. It is not true that the stats of Pokemon are going up over time. Since Gen 4, fully evolved Pokemon have had about the same base stat totals. Gen 9 is a little bit of an outlier in this, as it has the highest base stat total mean of any generation, but it's still really close to the other generations, so I would not consider that significant enough to be evidence of power creep. However, the fact that in more recent generations there are a lot more legendary Pokemon may contribute to the feeling of power creep, but these legendaries do not actually have better stats than overall than past legendaries. The one caveat to this is stat distribution. It's often said that Pokemon now have significantly better stat distributions than earlier generations. This is very difficult to test, as what a good stat distribution is really depends on a variety of things, including move pool, typing, and the ability of the Pokemon. For example, a glass cannon stat distribution is not going to be better than a defensive stat distribution on a regenerator Pokemon, but will likely be better on like a pure power Pokemon. Because of this, I don't have any hard data for whether stat distributions have gotten better over time, but I would argue that on average, this is not the case, but rather each generation has a couple Pokemon that have really good stat distributions. Next, we will look at usage stats to analyze this question. Let's look at each format for the past 10 years and see which generations have the most usage. The way that these numbers are calculated is that I've taken 1 month from each national dex and double restricted format and counted the number of times each Pokemon was used in a game, and then sum those uses over each generation. This method has the benefit of directly measuring how good each Pokemon is, or at least getting very close, given how much you want to think that usage stats measure how good a Pokemon is. The downside is that very good and very popular Pokemon are considered much more strongly than other Pokemon. This means that this metric will more so measure the generations by how good their top performers are than how good they are overall. The plots that you're looking at right now are the plots for the non-restricted formats. These are VGC 2015, VGC 2018, VGC 2021, Series 9, and VGC 2023, Regulation F. There's a clear upward trend in generations. You can see that the most recent generation is always the most used, with the rest usually following a downwards curve as you get towards the earlier generations. And here are the double restricted formats. They are mostly similar, but have less straightforward distributions, likely because of specific restricted Pokemon having a lot more staying power. For example, Kyogre is a Gen 3 Pokemon, but has been used forever, so Gen 3 is going to get a little bit of boost because of that. These plots are very clear evidence of power creep. And just a note, you may notice that for Gen 6 and 7, the plots for Gen 6 and 7, Gen 6 had very high usage, but it had almost none in the Gen 8 and Gen 9 formats. This is because a lot of those usage numbers were from Megas, which are no longer in game in Gen 8 and Gen 9. This brings me to a broader point. While these charts definitely indicate that there's an overall power creep, each generation initially seems so much stronger than the previous generations, before being left in the dust and somewhat equalizing with the previous generations once a new generation comes out. This is likely due to many Pokemon, including many of the top Pokemon, being balanced around the main mechanic of the generation, and once that mechanic is gone, they lose a lot of that strength. For example, Colossal was balanced around Dynamax until it got a lot of usage, but now it gets basically no usage. Additionally, many Pokemon get nerfed after their debut generations, whether with a stat nerf like Zacian or Zamazenta, or an ability nerf like Cinderace. This is all to say that Game Freak likes to make sure that the Pokemon added in each generation will thrive in that generation, but will not increase the power level too much in subsequent generations. So now we've explained why it seems like there's power creep, but there is still definitely some aspect that is just due to Pokemon getting stronger. We know from earlier that this is not caused by base stat totals increasing, so what is actually the mechanism of power creep? The answer is twofold. The main mechanism is busted abilities and optimized roles. Busted ability Pokemon are Pokemon like Urshifu. Maybe they have some really excellent traits, but the real talent and the thing that makes them top tier is their ability. Some more examples of this type of Pokemon are Goldengo, Shenpao, and Chi-Yu. The other category are Pokemon that are optimized for their role. Incineroar is a primary example of this. None of its individual traits, its Fire Dark typing, Intimidate, access to Fake Out and Parting Shot, and its bulky stat spread with good attack, are broken on their own, but combined they create the perfect pivot utility Pokemon. Other examples of this type of Pokemon include Raging Bolt, Rillaboom, and Farigiraf. In conclusion, power creep is real, but rather than taking the form of straight stat increases, it usually comes in the form of better abilities, signature moves, or optimized ability stat and move pool combinations. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.